That's all it is. The way you love me, the way you love me till the end. The way you love me, oh yeah, it makes me king again. When I find myself in the middle, in the middle, in the middle, could you love me more, just a little, just a little? Overcomplicate, but it's simple, but it's simple, but it's simple. Would you love me more, just a little? So tell me now, when every star falls from the sky and every last heart in the world
The first question we need to ask ourselves about making a list of thumbnails is, well, exactly are we rendering multiples of? The thumbnail, of course, right? Well, the thumbnail itself shouldn't really know how to make a list out of itself. We always want to make our components as small and composable as possible. So a thumbnail should only really know how to render a single discrete thumbnail. So instead, we're going to make a third component called thumbnail list. Thumbnail list is going to know how to make a list of thumbnails. We're going to pass in an options object that will tell it how to make these multiple thumbnails. So let's get started. We're going to start by copying our project directory, and we're going to rename it to thumbnail list. I'm going to open up our index.html, and then I'm going to open up our code editor. We have our thumbnail list open. Great. So let's get started by scaffolding out our thumbnail list. I'm going to say var thumbnail list, and we'll create a new React class and pass it a configuration object. The only method that we're going to add in here for right now is our render function. Great. The next thing we're going to do is update our create element. We're no longer creating an instance of thumbnail. We're making an instance of thumbnail list. So we'll just add on list, and now we're going to render thumbnail list. Next thing we got to concern ourselves about is our options object. We're currently passing in options that will render a single thumbnail. Now we need to figure out a way to pass in enough data to make multiple thumbnails. And the way we're going to do this is, instead of passing in a single object, we're going to pass in multiple objects. So we're going to wrap this object in an array. And then on the outside of that, we're going to make our lives a little bit easier. You're going to have to bear with me for just a second here by adding another object. The key to the array of objects will be thumbnail data, and that's going to point at the array of objects. So at this point, if we kind of remove this interior, all this data inside, we would have an options object, and this is just for example, that looks like this. We have a outside object that has a key thumbnail data that points at an array of object. And then each of these objects in here will have data on how to make a single instance of a thumbnail. So now that we've got our options object formed up a little better here, we need data for a second thumbnail. So to do so, I'm going to take our first instance of our options for the first thumbnail. I'm going to copy it. And then we're going to, since this is an array, I'm going to add a comma and then just paste. So now I should have an array with two objects in it. Now we need some data in here that's going to represent our second thumbnail. So we're just going to change a couple variables in here, a couple properties, excuse me. And instead of number being 12, we'll say 25. For the header, we're going to learn about something that's going to be in an upcoming section, which is gulp. For the description, we'll do a similar little blurb about gulp, and we'll say gulp will speed up your development workflow. And again, we're just going to save ourselves a little bit of time and just copy paste that over to get some filler text in there. Lastly, we need an image for the gulp logo. So let's hop over to Google, make a new tab, and we'll search for gulp space JS. Go to images, and this looks fantastic right here. I'll select it, view the image, and then we're going to take the URL at the top and replace the existing one. Okay, so now we have options for two separate thumbnails. Just to be clear, again, the overall structure of this object is an options that we're going to pass in this options object into the create element. This options object will have a single key, which is thumbnail data. That's going to point to an array of objects. And then each interior object describes what an individual instance of thumbnail is going to look like. Now let's go back to thumbnail list render method up here. We're going to make use of a native JavaScript function called map to turn these objects into components. We always use map on an array, and when you map an array, you call a function on every element in the array. The return value of this function gets added to a new array, and when that loop is complete, that new array gets returned. So that's a lot to digest. Let's do a practical example. We will return, actually first we'll do a list. So we'll say var list equals this.props. And again, think about how this options object is going to show up inside of this component. This object right here is exactly what props is. So to get our list of options in here, our list of individual thumbnail data options, we'll say this.props.thumbnail data. So right here, this reference right here will be pointing at this array. So we're going to map this array. And again, we're going to pass it a function. This function is going to get called on each of these objects. And the first argument to that function will be the object itself. So we'll call it thumbnail props. So you can kind of imagine that at this point in time, thumbnail props is going to first be this object. Whatever gets returned from this array will be the first element of list. It will then call this function on the second element, which will be this object. And this object will show up in this function as thumbnail props. And then whatever we return from the function will show up as the second element of list. So now that we're inside of here, we can really make our actual component, which is going to be thumbnail. We can make multiple instances of thumbnail. So I'm going to return not an li, just thumbnail. And we need to pass in some number or these actual properties into there. And the way, in this case, we have the entire object right here. And you might think, well, great, we can write out title equals thumbnail. Which is going to be thumbnail. We can make multiple instances of thumbnail. So I'm going to return not an li, just thumbnail. And we need to pass in some number or these actual properties into there. And the way, in this case, we have the entire object right here. And you might think, well, great, we can write out title equals thumbnail props.title and number equals blah, 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 and so on and so on. Well, React has a little shortcut here for whenever you want to pass in an entire object and not really worry about picking off individual options. And to do that, we're just going to do curly braces and then ... thumbnail props. And what this says is take this entire options object right here and create an instance of thumbnail passing in all of those properties in there. Okay, so now we should have a list, and list is going to be an array of thumbnail instances. Now all we have to do is render this onto the page. So we're going to return a div, and inside of that div is going to be our list. So let's save come over to our index.html. We're going to open our console just in case anything went wrong and refresh. Fantastic. We can see that we have two instances of thumbnail in here, and they're both being rendered by thumbnail list. Each instance has its own set of properties that match up perfectly with each object that we passed in. So you can see the first instance, of course, got Learn React, numbered 12 on the badge. Title is Show Courses, and similar for the second thumbnail right here. All right, fantastic. Now we know how to make a list. If this seems a little bit unclear, don't sweat it. Lists are something that we're going to do very frequently, so we're going to be coming back to the idea of rendering lists quite a bit. Catch you in the next section. Okay, we've completed our list example, and we can render multiple components at a time, nesting them inside one another. But let's take a step back and look at our code base. We currently have a single HTML file with about 60-something lines. If we start adding more features in here, things are going to start to get unmanageable pretty quickly. So I think that this is going to be a good time to learn how to refactor our code so that each separate class lives inside of its own file. Separating each component we make into a separate file is a very common way of organizing files in large JavaScript code bases. There's just one little problem here, and that's we need to figure out how to make sure that these individual JavaScript files that contain JSX are going to get compiled into actual JavaScript. In addition, between thumbnail, badge, and thumbnail list, and the code that provides our options down here, we want to be able to include each file as a separate script tag into our actual HTML document. So you can imagine if we split up badge, thumbnail, and thumbnail list all into its own separate files, then we start needing to require each of these different JavaScript files into our HTML document individually. And you could kind of imagine that gets really messy really quickly. For example, I might choose to rename thumbnail to something else, and all of a sudden I need to go back into my HTML document and update all my script tags. And that's a manual process, and that's not something we really like to do. So what that means is when we separate this out into separate files so that we can organize our code, when we require it back into our index.html file, we want to only include a single file, and that single file will be a concatenated version of all the individual files. So you might say to yourself, well, why are we going to separate it out but then join it all back together, through concatenation? And the answer is that we really want to organize our code base in separate files, but when we go to make use of those in the browser, we want them to be a single file again. So to summarize, we want to achieve the following. First, we want to break our current script tag into multiple JSX files, so this current script tag right here, with all the code inside of it, into separate JSX files. Second, we want to compile each JSX file into JavaScript. So each of these new JS files will include some JSX, and those need to be compiled into JavaScript. Third, we want to combine all these new files into a single JavaScript file. And then fourth, we want to include that into our HTML document as a single script tag up at the top. So before we go any further, I'm going to take a second here. I'm going to tell you that the next few sections here are going to be just a little bit painful. And the reason for that is that we're here to learn about React, but we're going to make a little bit of a detour around React. So please have patience as we walk through the tooling. It's going to feel like we're not learning React, but the tooling that goes around React is absolutely core to using it in production and using it for your own projects. So whenever we talk about using React, many sections ago I said that there are many new tooling and components and concepts vocabulary that are around React. And so whenever someone tells you that they know React, they don't really just know React.js. They know React and the entire ecosystem around it. So although it's going to feel like we're not making progress into learning React, this is really a necessary and needed step in learning how things work. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and get started. Our first step is going to be step number 1, which is to reorganize our components here and break each separate class out into its own file. So that's going to be our step 1. So let's get started. And we're going to do that by copying our thumbnail list project directory. And we're going to rename this one thumbnail gulp. And I'm going to change into gulp, and I'm going to open my code editor. Okay. So now that we have our copy of our project directory, reminder here that our goal right now is to break each of these files into its own separate, or each of these classes into its own separate file. So we're going to organize all these inside of a new folder, and I'm going to call that folder src for source. Next, each separate component needs its own file. And the kind of the nomenclature we're going to use here is the file is going to be named after the class that it contains. So we'll have badge.jsx, thumbnail.jsx, thumbnail.jsx, and so on. So I'm going to make a total of 4 new files here. Thumbnail.jsx, thumbnail list.jsx, badge.jsx, and finally app.jsx. And you might be saying to yourself, well, this doesn't make any sense. We don't have a component called app. That's true. The purpose of app, and we will usually have a file called app, or it might be main or some similar term. And the purpose of that file is to basically bootstrap or do the initial options definition and rendering of our top level component, which in this case is thumbnail list. So the purpose of app is being the place where we actually kick off the start of our application. Thumbnail by itself or badge by itself doesn't render itself until we tell it to. And so app is where we kick that process off. Okay. So now we're going to copy paste all the relevant code into each file. So we'll start off with app.jsx. And again, app is going to contain all the options we need to get the rendering process started. So I'm going to select everything from var options all the way through react.render. And I'm not going to include the script tag at the bottom. I'm going to cut. I'm going to go into app.jsx and paste and save. Once this code's in here, I'm just going to go ahead and close the file. Next up is thumbnail list.